Almost all film studies programs, literature, humanities programs are incorporating eco-cinema and environmental studies programs. I'm in an environmental studies program. So we're all starting to incorporate cinema in. And what I want to do today is, if you had read the abstract, there are 3 questions really. 1, why? Right? Why this? Why eco-cinema now? 2, can we make sense of what this thing is? And when I say eco-cinema, I changed my title slightly. You'll see over here. It says Ecocinema Studies. And that is because I know this part of the conference is academic. So we're trying to think of how do we study what we call eco-cinema, or what do we even call eco-cinema. So the question of what it is, and then how do we do it. So those are 3 questions. I hope you'll come away with some answers. But that's not it. Right? Those are the pasts and presents of the field. What I also want you to think about, and what excited me about coming here, is that there is a future. And if you're interested in this field, I think Indian eco-critics and non-Western eco-critics have a very important part to play. And I want to invite you to that. I myself have been living in the US for 20 years, so you can contend, am I really Indian or not? But my first 20 years of my life I spent here in India, and so my interests come with that Indian perspective. Even though of course it's been completely changed, not completely changed, but it's been influenced by being in the US. Okay? So that's my introduction here. One thing I will say is, when I lecture, I will often ask for a little bit of audience interaction. In my own classes, I have discussions, but I know we're timed. So I'm not going to say, okay, give me your answer in the middle, but what I will often ask you is these questions of how many? Do you know? And I just want a show of hands. Can you all do that for me? Yeah? Throughout? Okay. Okay. Well, let's get started. Here's the order of what I'm talking about. 3 things I want to cover. The order of what I want is pasts, and then presents, which I'll spend some time on. And then I want to think about, at the very end, the futures, and I'm going to open it up to discussion at that point with the futures. Okay? So to start with the past, I'm going to personalize it. What's the scholarship? Of course, I'm a PhD student. I have to look and see what have other people done in the past. What's the scholarship? So what do you think the scholarship was in 2003? Not much. There's very, very little out there. And I will give you an example of some of the stuff that was out there. How many of you have seen these books? Anyone here? One person. Which one? Green screen, yes, yeah. So there was some work that was out there, and what do you notice about these titles? One says Real Nature, Wildlife on Film. One says Hollywood Cinema. And then one is Garden in the Machine. So what do we notice about these? People are talking about cinema, but they're talking about very particular kinds of cinema. Hollywood, there's work done on Hollywood. There's some work by a historian, this guy Greg Mittman over here, done a really interesting thing. Look at nature documentaries, the sort of things you see on Discovery Channel and Wildlife, Animal Planet, that kind of stuff, right? And then this over here, I put this up over here. Does anyone have heard of this one, The Garden in the Machine? The author of this book, a man called Scott McDonald, is the man who's known as, yes, I'm seeing a nod. Yes, eco-cinema. He's the guy who coined the word eco-cinema. But what he was doing was he was looking at art cinema. So you have some work, but it's very specific to a type of cinema that they're looking at. And what you notice about all these is none of these fit the type of cinema that I was looking at, which was what? A social documentary, an activist social documentary. So here you have a wildlife documentary, but think of the kind of wildlife films you have when you watch Animal Planet or Nature. You see lots of animals, but not so many people. And of course, it's not Hollywood. So at this point, I said we have to do something about this. And what I did was very similar to what your professor colleagues here in the US do, is I started to look and see, well, are there other people who are also interested in this? And just like Dr. Rayson started to read around and look around and found me, I found all these other people who were equally interested in doing more. Why are we not paying attention to cinema as a whole? And so I'm going to speed through time. And here's the thing, I'm going to give you guys a softball question to ask me if you want at the end. If you want to ask what happens between 2003 and now, right, that's a good question for the question and answer session. But let's go to now. So what does the scholarship look like now? It's a whole different field. There is tons and tons and tons of work out there. Here's just a sampling of some of the work out there. I'm going to add here. How many of you are familiar with any of these texts? A few of my professors over here. We have only a sampling, but a lot of it, and the reason I put this in at the end is this is from here. This is Indian eco-critics. This is your professor, Dr. Rayson, Dr. Deborah, and they are putting together work on eco-cinema studies. So there's been a lot of work, and what's interesting about the work that's doing is now we're not just looking at a particular film type. We're trying to think of cinema as a whole. What is this thing called cinema? Why should we pay attention to it? So I'm going to just say a little bit over here, very little bit over here, and that is you can imagine as we, as scholars are having conversations, we're not all agreeing. Okay? We're all trying to say, okay, what is this thing? We're not all on the same page. In fact, this book over here, my colleague Paula Viloket-Markandi, it came out in 2010, and she said, this is what I think eco-cinema should be. It is an activist film. Do you get sucked into a film? Can all of you just for a minute think of a film you've just been sucked into? Films have that affect on us. We're not always rationally thinking when we're watching films. And that's what's really interesting about this collection, because it says, what does that mean when we are not rationally always thinking? And I'll give you an example. How many of you have seen horror films? Everybody. How many of you get scared when you watch horror films? It's okay to say. Nothing's happening to you. You're sitting in the comfort of your room. What is it about the film that makes you scared? Right? How does that virtual experience have that very material response from you? It's the audio and the visual working together. And what this collection gets to, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about, is that when we are in that realm of affect and emotion, there is something that triggers us that has consequences on how we then act later in the world, or can have consequences for how we then act later in the world. And I'll actually, this is not a softball question, but you're welcome to ask me more questions about this in discussion, because it really is an interesting concept to me. This one here, Nadia Bozak, the cinematic footprint, can anyone just really tell me what do you think this book's about? Has anyone seen it? Impacts, material impacts, literally like what is the carbon footprint of a cinema? Yeah. Yeah. So she does a really interesting job looking at things like, can you imagine a Hollywood film or a Tollywood film or a Bollywood film? They go to New Zealand to film, they go to Switzerland and wherever. You can imagine what that means for the cinematic footprint, as opposed to say like the film we saw yesterday. 51 days of shooting in one location. How much energy goes into that? And it's important to think of that because technology is so much a part of our world. What is that material impact? So she gets at that. This one here, I put up here because I think it's particularly important to us as audiences. What do we mean by a transnational ecocinema? Across nations. Right? Migration, yes. The migration, but also in terms of production, when we think about it, where do Hollywood films have their animators? Right here in India. Yeah. So if film itself is, now they say, film in some ways has no borders. Even a film like Yesterday, where do you think their cameras are made? Yeah. So we have to think about it transnationally because our ecological effects are transnational. And I think this is the foresight of this conference. This is the foresight of all of you and Dr. Rayson to invite someone like me from America to India. Because we can have these conversations. If the medium we're looking at is transnational, then we need to have transnational conversations. What does it mean for cinema in the US? What does it mean for cinema here? So that book I wanted to highlight as well. These are sort of frameworks that I'm highlighting. What I want to do for the rest of the talk is I want to just use 2 examples from my own research to give you a sense of how I put some of these concepts into practice. This is the question that we sort of all ask as eco-cinema scholars, right? What insights can thinking of cinema as ecological machine afford us? What insights, and here I mean really ecological insights. How does it help us think about the environment if we think of cinema as this machine? The problem is there's a little pond over here. And in this pond, these villagers are able to farm. And so they say, no, this is green land. They shouldn't be taking our land. So this debate is here. But at the heart of the debate is a longer history of unequal relations. And what that history does with this temple. So the temple is the place that sold the land that belonged to these guys. And the temple said, this is our land. And the villagers said, hold on, this is our land. So what Mr. Kumar wanted to do was to show not that what's going on in the present, but this long history. How do you do that? How do you represent history though? Especially through documentary, through live action. So what I want us to think about in that theorizing part is there is this post-colonial scholar, Rob Nixon, and he's written this book called Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor. And I have issue with the word poor, kind of like Mr. Saxena does too, because poor it suggests that you're less, you're less. And I would say instead of saying environmental of the poor, we can think of it as environmentalism of the marginalized. Because you might be in quality of life, you might not be poor. In happiness, you might not be poor. Okay? But you are marginalized in society. Okay? But what is important to his work is this concept of slow violence. How many of you have heard this term before? Slow violence. Slow poison, yeah, it's very similar to slow poison. In fact, let me use his words to define it. So I have a little quote from him. And he says, it points to violence that is slow and attritional and therefore almost invisible. It does not lend itself to easy representation. It's almost invisible. And here's what he says, it never materializes in one spectacular, explosive, cinematic scene. If you think of yesterday's movie, there was a scene in there where there was tension. You could film it and you could get that tension. In this case, there's no actual tension. Nobody's protesting. So how do you represent this long history of marginalization of these people? So he said, I'm going to try to tackle this challenge. This is what I'm going to do. And the way I'm going to do it is I'm a documentarian, I'm going to go talk to people. And so he talked to the villagers. And he said, I'm going to do it. So I forget the young man yesterday who asked the question of objectivity, right? He said, I want to be objective. I want to see everyone's point of view. So he talked to the villagers, but he also talked to the temple people. And then he went ahead and said, you know, it's not just the temple people, it's also the entrepreneurs, right? The people who are going to build this business over here. I'm going to go talk to them. And there's one other person or one other constituency that's involved in here as well, and that is the politicians. And it just so happened there was a political campaign going on at that time. So he said, I'm going to talk. He wasn't able to talk to them, but he was able to film some of that and get some TV footage of information from the politics. Just like yesterday, if you notice, they had the NDR TV stuff. Yeah, same thing that he was trying to do in his. So he had all this in his documentary. And the problem for him, though, was he said it just wasn't interesting. He said it's just talking heads. Kind of like me, right? I'm just talking to you. And he said it doesn't capture violence. It doesn't capture what we have done systemically to a community to make them so powerless. It just doesn't. He's like, I have to do this. I have to capture it so that we can understand the depth of the issue, of the environmental justice of throwing these people off their land. So what does he do? He says, okay, I am going to use some animation. And he actually worked with one of his students. Are there any art students in this, or people who do art in here? He worked with one of his students who works with animation, and he said, I'm going to try to show the slow violence by accelerating it. Sci-fi fiction. Yes, sci-fi fiction. And this is the independent TV show. It's part of this future states. And in fact, I'm going to show you some stills from here. When you look at this still over here, what do you think of? Yeah? Like Star Trek, did I hear that? Yes, yes. Yes, it is a sci-fi film that when you go into it, feels a lot like Star Trek. In fact, it's 15 minutes short and it's got a very generic, notice the word I'm using, very generic plot. There's this team, they're on a mission, they're on a starship, and they're going to Mars and they're going to colonize Mars with this corn. Because why? Well, we're not quite sure, but it looks like Earth is done. Okay? So another way we often think about these kind of films is we think about them as speculative fiction, sci-fi, right? We speculate about our futures. Okay? So very generic. What has it got to do with the environment? Quite a bit, actually. And when we theorize this and we think of the genre, I want us to think about what it is, because I want to say that what this particular film is a term that's used in Indigenous or Native American studies because it talks back. It talks back to the genre. Okay? And I put this picture here because it talks back. Who's a captain in this show? This is a captain. A woman. Does she look like most of the captains that we see in science fiction made in the West? Is she a white person? No, she's not. And that's one way in which the film is talking back. It's saying, hey, hold on, white people don't always have to be in charge. This is very important in America, especially, right? She's a native person. So that's one way it's talking back. But the one way we want to think about this talking back is also, and that's another still from the film. More talking back. That's a little bit later in the film. Does that look like what you would necessarily see in a sci-fi film? No. No. So she's challenging this genre or the formula of what we expect. But to think a little bit more about this, here's a quote that I put up from this historian, Carl Abbott, and the quote says, sci-fi genres have an uneasy companionship with the American West. Can anyone tell me why? Hint. Frontiers. So why frontiers? Why are frontiers important? When the settlers came to America, when the cowboys came to America, it was to conquer land. Right? We were always seeing the land through the cowboys' point of view. We never saw the land through the Indians' point of view, or very rarely did we see the land through the Indians' point of view. That's the Western, though. Sci-fi? Is there a frontier in there? Is there an Indian in here? Some version of an indigenous community? Yeah. But are we seeing it through the Western perspective? Yes. Yes, right? This is the uneasy relationship that Carl Abbott is referring to in this film.
When making a documentary or any such film particularly devoted to the ecology, how difficult is it to balance reality and tendency to romanticize? I found it in literature even while by activists also. I won't give names, but I found such examples by activists also in literature. So how difficult is it to balance reality and the tendency to romanticize, even when we are talking about talking back?
Yes, exactly. So that's where we as eco-critics come into play, right? I'm not the filmmaker, but I can ask that question just like you do. Is that a romantic representation of Native people, or is it more complicated? Because we know Native people, just like the tribal people here, they're in these sort of caught between modernity and their own lives, and they're negotiating that relationship. Okay? Nothing is black and white. And we eco-critics can point to that by talking about the film with all its complexity, which I haven't done. And I would say I could agree with it. I have a lot of issue with films that are romanticized. Yeah. In fact, this film that I show, I only showed you a couple of clips that look romanticized, but it's actually the fact that she's a captain on an airship and not just the woman with her spiritual things complicates that relationship. Yeah, yeah. No, I think that's why we do what we do, right? We don't want to say that this is a romantic way of looking at the world, because in reality, things are much more complex. Yeah, great question. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just wondering, the films which we normally talk in terms of eco-cinema are all these documentaries and, you know, films which have a lot of issues in them. But I was also wondering about the mainstream Hollywood and Bollywood films. I mean, they also are, you know, they can be interpreted in a way that, you know, that lends itself to eco-cinema. Can you talk something about that?
Yes, yes, absolutely. Yeah, and this is something that, you know, those 12 years I said that went by and we had our differences. This was a debate that was in the field. Should we think of Hollywood and Bollywood film as environmental cinema? And I had this conversation with Dr. Rayson just the other day. He said, if we just focus on documentaries, a certain type of person will watch documentaries. That person is also already ideologically on your side. You're preaching to the choir. But if you talk about Hollywood or a film with mass appeal like that, people might go to that film to be entertained. But you can have a conversation about it. And I'll give you an example. Avatar. Yeah? In my film class in the US, when I say we're going to watch In God's Land, they're like, okay, you know, they're environmental studies students. But they won't watch it on their own. How many of you would go watch that film on your own? Only those who are really dedicated. But they all want to watch Avatar. And I say it Avatar the way the Americans say it, because that's how they say it as opposed to Avatar. Right? They all want to watch that film, and we can have the same sort of discussions. So I think it's very, very, very important to include those films in there. That's where that notion of affect comes in. If you are enjoying that film, if that film is speaking to you in some form or shape or form, I can push you that little bit further to think about it in new ways. Your documentaries would potentially have smaller audiences. But did everyone hear? I think I heard two questions also. One was about production, right? And this notion of how we think about why we produce the documentaries. Am I right? Yes. So if there's a documentary maker who's making it for money and not about issues. Yeah? This actually goes back, I think, to the question that maybe you or someone asked last night about truth. Yeah? Yeah. And I would have responded to that question by saying it's ethics. It's about ethics. So if you're concerned about ethics and you're thinking about ethical issues, then you value truth in different ways. You might say, objectively, of course, the government has a side. But ethically, what does that side mean? So I think that's the question that gets to your first, that's the answer that gets to your first question of production. We have to think about the ethics. And the second question is about reception. Who gets to see those? And I think there's room for every kind of film. In my book that I co-edited on Ecocinema studies, we say all cinema should be studied. Because all cinema, because of that variety that I mentioned, right, we have to pay attention to variety. What affects one person is not going to affect another person. Some of you looked really sleepy when I was showing In God's Land. It's just the way it is. That's how film works.